Onward we go into the yellow brushes, first of which is pinch. Now this is one of my most used brushes. It does exactly what you would expect. If we stroke along this edge, it will draw in the geometry and make it very tight, very sharp. And this is something I use for hard-edged sculpting, but also for organic sculpting like creases. And if we turn on our geometry with the wireframe overlay, you'll see that it really is sucking in that geometry into the center of the stroke. And so there's not much more to explain beyond that. Very intuitive brush, very effective. Next we have grab. Also one of my most used brushes. You've already seen me use this already earlier in this course. And we simply grab a portion of the mesh underneath our brush radius, and it will follow whatever direction our cursor goes. And again, not much to describe beyond this. It's a very simple functionality, but very common need for this type of function. Next, we have elastic deform, which is like the grab brush, but on steroids. So if we do the same thing, click and drag, you'll notice that a lot more of our sculpture is manipulated far beyond the boundaries of our sculpting cursor. And so that's a pretty unique feature of this brush. I don't use this a lot, but I do feel like I could use it more. And so if I think about earlier on in the sculpting process when things can be a little more freeform and less precise, this makes sense to use. Later on in the process, when we want to be more precise, it would be annoying to have so much of the sculpture affected by a small brush. And so it's misleading because there's a lot more under the hood that this brush can do. If we jump to the brush menu, there's several types of deformation, and the default is tri-scale grab. There's also a biscale grab and a regular grab. I mean, who knew that grabbing could be so complicated to need 3 formulas? So play around with those. I would just stick to the tri-scale default usually, but there's also a scale and a twist. And so if we jump over to scale, let's pick a feature like, let's use this for example. Often, if I'm sculpting a character's face, either the eyes or the mouth, the nose can be a little too small or a little too big. And so it's nice to be able to click and drag on a certain feature and scale it up or scale it down with a click and drag of a mouse or pen. Now, in demonstrating this, I realize I should use this more often because I will do something similar with the pinch brush by making the radius big and then stroking over the same area. Sort of does the same thing in a very rudimentary, imprecise way. And so now I've realized I should be doing that with the elastic deform brush. Also, we have that twist deformation functionality, and this will allow us to click and rotate, which I have needed to do again for facial features, especially like the ears maybe rotated backwards a little too much, or any facial feature, just a click and drag type of rotation movement is useful in the right situation. So this is one of those brushes with a lot more power than maybe is there at face value. So definitely spend time playing around with the deformations. There's a few brushes like this with a lot more power under the hood. Next, we have the snake hook brush. This is like grab, except it leaves a trail behind in your geometry. And so it's perfect for pulling out octopus tentacles or horns, that kind of thing, even rudimentary arms, for example. And with a static mesh like we are using, if we enable our wireframe again, the problem with snake hook is that it quickly runs out of geometry when the mesh does not update dynamically. You can see these very stretched polygons, which ends up causing visual artifacts. However, if we use it with dynamic topology or remeshing, this artifact issue is irrelevant. So this is a brush I commonly use, especially in conjunction with these other 2 methods, but we'll go over that in their respective videos. Next, we have the thumb brush, and admittedly, I have never used this brush. And, you know, in my experimentation with it, I think it's trying to simulate, you know, real life sculpting where you take your thumbs and kind of push against the surface. I think that's what it's trying to do. So maybe if you really want that connection back to physical sculpting, it'll be a useful brush for you. For me, it just feels like a low strength grab. And so I would just use the low strength grab personally. You know, the way my mind works, this is a lot of brushes. And so if I can eliminate some of them from my mind, that, you know, helps make me more efficient. And so thumb, you know, nothing wrong with using it, obviously. It's just one of those brushes that doesn't do enough unique functionality where I never end up using it. But for any of these brushes, if you do see a good use for it, please enlighten me in the comments below. I'm always up for learning something new. And the next brush is the pose brush. And this one expects a limb or an appendage that would make sense to pose. Like, for example, these strokes we made with the snake hook brush. It doesn't make a ton of sense to pose, you know, something like this, the big chunk of the digital ball of clay. But for limbs is what it is designed for. So if you can imagine that this is an arm, actually this one is kind of intentionally an arm. So if I use my annotation, let's say that, oh, we have that turned off, that overlay. Let's say this is the elbow, right? And then this is the shoulder, and then this is the wrist, right? So I would want to move this in a kind of hierarchical way. And so this, we start at the tip, and then this white line is drawn out based on the radius of our brush. So if I want that to extend over here into the elbow, I will increase the size of our brush, and then I can click and drag and rotate. All right, so it's like we rotate the forearm. And then if I make this even bigger, I can do the entire arm. Might have to zoom out a little bit. And it can be difficult to find the right spot, trying to get it into the middle of the shoulder. Okay. Right? So you can do that sort of thing with the pose brush. Now, this isn't maybe an ideal example. I suspect that this was probably designed for fingers. If you wanted to pose fingers on your sculpture, this would be arguably the most effective method. Next, we've got the nudge brush. Now, once again, this is a brush I don't use very often. Okay, that's being too generous. I've never used the nudge brush, in fact, but in rehearsing this demonstration, I realized I could be using it more. So at first, it kind of looks like a low strength grab or even the thumb brush. However, there's a distinct difference. If you imagine this is some sort of character face, and this lump is like a scar or some big, you know, freckle or something, and I wanted to move it across the face, if I did that with the grab brush, you know, it does not respect the curvature of the underlying shape. And so you end up losing that as you make your stroke. Whereas the nudge brush, it does try and respect the underlying shape. So to demonstrate this a little more clearly, if I take the grab brush and pull it down, it will create a dimple inside of our volume. But if I take the nudge brush and do the same thing, notice that it does not go inward into the volume of our sculpture. It tries to respect the curvature. Now, it's not perfect, but this is maybe an extreme example, but if my character had like a small mole or scar that I wanted to move, this would be an effective way to do that without making the underlying face lopsided. So it's not a brush I hardly ever use, but I definitely see where it could be useful. The rotate brush is, you know, very similar in behavior to the elastic deform twist deformation, except it's older. It's like the old way of rotating or twisting. And so it feels a little more limited, rudimentary. I have used it before, but honestly, I think I would probably use the elastic deform twist instead. And then we have the slide relax brush. Now this one's very unique and specific in its use. We need to turn on our wireframe once again. So this brush attempts to maintain the existing shape of the mesh while moving the topology only. So this is good for the stretching artifacts here in the snake hook strokes that we made. So if I pull out and slide this geometry, you'll see that it's kind of sliding along our shape, and then we can remedy some of that stretching just by dragging out the topology. And it's so interesting that it keeps the shape, which is virtually impossible to do any other way. If you grabbed it, you know, you're gonna really mess up the shape along the way. So that's more of a technical brush, utility type brush, but you know, in the right situation, it would save you a lot of time. So that is slide relax. Now boundary. This one's a very unique brush. It's another one of those with a lot of power under the hood, a ton of functionality, but honestly, the use cases are extremely small. So I don't want to take too much time on this brush, but definitely want to show you enough to invite you to experiment and play with it. So if we try and use it on this mesh, absolutely nothing will happen, and you'll think, it's broken. This brush is nothing. But that's because it requires a mesh boundary, or in other words, a hole in the mesh. So I'm going to jump back over to object mode to demonstrate this with a cylinder, and specifically a cylinder without a cap at all. So we'll turn our cap fill type to nothing, and then I'm going to make the radius a lot skinnier too. So being a skinny cylinder, one of the most, I think, on point examples is if you were sculpting a character with clothing. Imagine this is a sleeve and this is where the hand would be. This kind of situation is where this brush really shines. Not to suggest this is the only use case for it, but I need some more geometry before I jump over to sculpt mode. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, Control R, and mouse wheel up. So I have several new edge loops. And this should be enough geometry to demonstrate. So with that selected, we'll go back over to sculpt mode. And now the boundary brush lights up. All right, we can see that it's definitely doing something. And so if we click and drag, you'll see that if you imagine this being a sleeve, it's like you're rolling up your sleeves and folding it back on itself. And so, that's interesting, but this is such a harsh fall off. It doesn't feel organic and sculpting like all of the other brushes are. And that's because it's built with more of a polygon modeling mindset. And so we have a lot of options that we can change the fall off. For whatever reason, the default is constant. Whereas if you change that to smooth, you'll get a much more, organic, smooth type of result. But the behavior of the brush essentially folding in on itself is referred to as a bend type deformation. Under our brush settings, deformation is set to bend. We have several options. Expand will simply almost extrude these edges out. Now it's not creating any additional geometry, but it is moving precisely with the way these edges are pointed, right? It's not moving left or right, but just straight out. So if you ever needed to extend the sleeves, for example, that would be useful. We also have inflate and, just kind of pushes the verts along the surface normal. And then we also have grab. All right, so this will follow your mouse cursor, but it's taking the entire boundary loop, okay? Compare that to just regular grab brush. It's only grabbing those faces, most close to the camera, closest to the camera. And so back to our boundary brush. We have a twist and smooth behavior as well. And I'm not going to go into each one of these, but definitely invite you to play with them. So that's the deformation type, but there's also interesting functionality in the boundary fall off. So the constant default method takes the entire boundary edge as highlighted in yellow down here. But if we switch it to brush radius, it will be limited to only the area that we click within the brush cursor. And so it's maybe not quite so obvious with the grab. If we try bend, this could be useful for like creating the spout of a pitcher, a water pitcher or something like that. Additionally, we have the loop method, which still respects the brush radius, but it kind of arrays the behavior around the loop. Now, this is useful for creating a type of frilled border if this were a sleeve of a shirt. And so that's pretty cool. Cool because this would be extremely difficult to do with regular sculpting tools, but obviously it's a very specific use case. So it's the kind of thing that's, extremely powerful, but maybe you only use it once a year, once in your sculpting career. They also have a different method, which I can't quite figure out where this would be useful. It's called loop inverted. And so, in a couple spots, the behavior goes outward, but then in other spots, it goes inward. I don't quite understand that one, but it's there. Sure, there's a use for it. And then there's also this deformation target, which by default is geometry. But if you switch to cloth simulation, all of a sudden, you introduce the cloth behavior, which has its own brush that we'll go over. But it's just fascinating that, that very powerful functionality is just kind of thrown in. So anyway, I do believe this brush was designed with clothing sleeves in mind, which definitely comes in handy. Just not that often unless you're constantly sculpting characters. So that is by far not everything you can do with the brush. It's the kind of thing that really rewards experimentation, so play with that. It will be a lot of fun. And that's going to be it for our yellow brushes. After this, we've got several more utility brushes and very specific use case brushes that we'll go over in subsequent videos.